I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone on the Zoom and YouTube who have joined us for an evening of extremely informative health talk that is relevant for current times on the topic of a lifestyle approach to preventing and reversing insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes with Dr. Ronesh Sinha. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome today's guest speaker, Dr. Ronesh Sinha. As most of us are of Indian descent, I assume, and have heard about India being the diabetic capital of the world, it certainly seems scary to hear that title, but I'm sure that as there is a reason for it, so is there a solution. So here we have an accomplished doctor, Dr. Sinha, who has done some groundbreaking work in health and wellness with a focus on not only preventing but also reversing diabetes. Dr. Sinha, we are very happy, humbled, and excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have a little bit of a health and wellness journey of my own, having made a shift from a software engineer to a holistic yoga and wellness coach. My solution to preventing and reversing not just diabetes, but any disease is to eat right, move more, breathe deep, and meditate, which probably isn't going to solve all the problems. So I am eager to listen from the experts in the field. I have been closely associated with Seva Mandara, the philanthropic wing of New England Kannada Koota, which has been doing several community service projects for the past 8 years. Today's program is one such project from Seva Mandara to educate and empower the community with this insightful topic on diabetes. We are fortunate to have Dr. Harohalli Shashidhar in the team, who is the brain behind all of Seva Mandara wellness initiatives. He is a pediatric gastroenterologist in Elliott Hospital, Manchester, New Hampshire. I would like to extend my warm welcome and thank him for being instrumental in bringing Dr. Sinha today for this discussion. At first, Dr. Sinha will be providing some insightful information and share his experience in dealing with diabetes, especially with South Asians. Following his talk, Dr. Shashidhar will be moderating the question and answer segment. So if you haven't already, please send your questions. I guess now it's on Zoom only, I believe. And Dr. Shashidhar will try his best to get to your question based on the most commonly asked and most beneficial to everyone. Over to you, Dr. Shashidhar.
Thank you, Nikhil Aure. Good evening, everybody. At the outset, I would like to wish happy Plavanama Samvatsara Yugadi to everyone. Here is to New Year, renewed beginnings and renewed spirits. Thank you for the kind introduction. A little too kind, but I graciously accept it. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ronesh Sinha. Before I do that, I have a couple of housekeeping matters to discuss. One is about the question answer session. We expect to have a very vigorous Q&A session. So please post it on the chat box. We may have certain issues with the social media, as you can all see going forward, but we will try to troubleshoot it as best as we can. Secondly, Dr. Sinha has also asked us to please refrain from asking highly individual specific patient care questions. He is not able to provide personal medical advice on this forum. Dr. Sinha is an internist by background and training. He currently holds a dual appointment, one as the Senior Medical Director for Sutter Health's Palo Alto Medical Foundation. In this role, he helps design innovative health education programs and clinical services for Bay Area employers. He is also the Chief Medical Officer for Silicon Valley Employers Forum. He serves as a global advisor to shape and influence the benefit strategy for over 55 major Silicon Valley companies. His groundbreaking work in employer health and wellness with a focus on preventing and reversing diabetes in diverse populations has received global attention. This has also earned him front cover stories in the Fortune magazine and LA Times. He's a recipient of the Silicon Valley Business Journal's Excellence in Healthcare Award. He is a two-time TED talker. He's also a sought after speaker on corporate wellness events. In addition to all this, he finds time to actively blog on health matters, and you can find him at culturalhealthsolutions.com. His passion and mission is about developing innovative, culturally tailored solutions to help diverse populations lead healthier lives. So today's topic, as Dr. Ronesh Sinha would speak on, is a lifestyle approach to preventing and reversing insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, especially focused on South Asian population. We've been waiting for this talk and tried to arrange this over multiple months in 2020. So I'm very excited to be here, and without much further delay, please, Dr. Sinha.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm introduction and for the opportunity to talk to your audience. So let me go ahead and pull up my screen here. And first of all, I just want to do a sound check. Thumbs up. You guys can hear me okay? Yeah, sounds okay? Okay, perfect. Great. Okay. And you can see my slides as well too? Yeah? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Even though the topic is specifically diabetes and insulin resistance, we're going to expand much beyond that too. Obviously, diabetes and insulin resistance are very common health conditions, especially in our community. But if you come away with the right messages from this talk, you should be able to apply to other conditions that are really afflicting our population as well. So let's go ahead and jump right in here. We've already done the intro. So first, I just wanted to start off with just a quick case study. I mean, this is an older case study, but just to give you an idea of the power of lifestyle changes, I have a clinic dedicated to reversing chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes with lifestyle changes rather than medications. So this is a 52-year-old software engineer who had been pre-diabetic since 2003. And if you just look at the labs that are circled, this is somebody who was basically diagnosed with full-blown diabetes in June of 2014. You can see the red circle around the 195 for the triglycerides. In June 2014, developed an A1C of 7.5. The A1C basically is a composite score of your blood sugar. And this is someone who is about to be put on medications, got referred to me, and someone with really strong family history of diabetes too. So in many of my South Asians, they feel like they're genetically predestined to develop the same conditions as their parents. But what they don't realize is genetics only plays a very small role in these conditions. Lifestyle is really primary. So you can see within just a few months, we reversed the diabetes completely with very simple lifestyle changes. Patient didn't need any medications at all. So hopefully that's a message of hope for many of you that are struggling with health issues, because most of them really can be impacted significantly through lifestyle changes. Now, the way when I give talks to tech companies, I like to sort of take science and physiology and transfer it to technology a little bit so we can sort of look at it through a window that all of us understand. And what I tell people is the conditions that we inherit, often they're like apps on a phone. Okay, so think of your smartphone as being all of your genetic material. And these apps are things that we might inherit from our family members. So for example, you might have inherited the app for type 2 diabetes, for obesity, for cancer, for Alzheimer's disease. Now, the good news is for most of these conditions, for most chronic health conditions, you as an individual have the power to turn that app on or off. And the things that turn those disease apps on or off are things like emotions, believe it or not. So stress, depression, anxiety, food, and particularly micronutrient deficiencies, inactivity, sleep deprivation, and toxin exposures. And this is a key point I make because when I see Indians in my clinic where every family member has a chronic health condition like diabetes or early heart disease, I tell them that yes, you have inherited the app probably from your family, but they had lifestyle choices that turned those apps on. But you can be the person that actually makes the correct lifestyle choices to turn those apps off so they don't manifest as chronic health conditions. So that's one way for us to sort of understand this so we don't feel like we're victimized by our genes. Now, if there's two major central processes you should understand when it comes to most chronic health conditions, and I'm going to go over these at a very high level. On the left is a condition called inflammation. The second one is a condition called insulin resistance. And these are processes that are really critical for you to understand because you can see from the spirals, they really encompass most of the chronic health conditions we see. And although I'm putting them in separate buckets, there's actually overlap between these two. Many of my patients that have insulin resistance also have inflammation, and inflammation can be a central root cause that triggers insulin resistance. I'm going to help define these terms so they make more sense. So let's start off with inflammation. So what is inflammation? Okay. Inflammation, flame, is fire. It's heat. It's Agni. Okay. So this person who sprained their ankle, you can see that that ankle is swollen, it's hot, and it's red. That is inflammation that is visible externally to the human eye. But when we talk about inflammation in diseases, and I'm sorry, let me just pause on this. When we talk about inflammation with diseases, what that really is when your immune system actually overreacts and can actually become activated. So that's sort of invisible inflammation, which you may not see on the outside, but it can generate a lot of underlying chronic health conditions. So just keep inflammation in mind. Now, today's talk, we're going to focus on insulin resistance, okay? And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the slide, because if you understand the slide, you will understand why we suffer from so many of the common conditions that I end up seeing in the clinic. So I explained to people that insulin resistance is essentially a carbohydrate parking problem. What I mean by that is, if you look at the central image here of a car, think of the carbs that we consume as being a car, okay? We have 3 parking lots in the body. In the top left, we've got the muscle parking lot. In the bottom, we've got the liver, the bottom left. And then on the right side, we have the fat parking lot. And on a daily basis, as we consume carbohydrates, our goal is to get most of that traffic going towards the muscle parking lot. So in a normal healthy person, when you eat something, even if it's healthy carbs, 80% of that at least should be cleared by the muscle parking lot. And the way the carbs get inside that muscle parking lot is by using the hormone insulin. That is the parking pass that gets the carbs through the door. So when I say the vast majority of Indians have some degree of insulin resistance, what I'm saying is your body is actually producing the insulin parking pass, but the muscle is saying, sorry, I'm not going to accept the signal. And that means maybe some of the carbs are getting inside, but then we have all this overflow traffic that gets rerouted to the other sites. So it can go towards fat storage, especially the belly fat. That's where we get the belly fat, the obesity that we call central obesity or visceral adipose tissue. It can go to the liver. And the liver, what it does with abundant amounts of carbohydrates is it stores it as fat. And that's why in Indians, fatty liver is becoming a major epidemic. You know, when I learned in medical school about fatty liver, we thought it was just alcoholics that got fatty liver. But now we have seen that non-alcoholic fatty liver has actually trumped regular fatty liver. And in my clinic, it's typically Indian vegetarians that have never touched alcohol. It's young kids and teenagers that are drinking so much juice, soda, and junk food that they already have a liver that looks like an alcoholic. And this is really an epidemic in Asian kids, Chinese kids, and Indian kids. My wife, being a pediatrician, has seen tons of fatty liver in young kids, which is absolutely startling. Now, when the liver is overwhelmed with carbohydrates, it exports it as blood fat that we know as triglycerides. And high triglycerides is probably the most common cholesterol condition we see in South Asians, and it's a sign of insulin resistance that we'll talk about. So at a very high level, as we go through lifestyle changes, my job is to teach you, how do we get the carbohydrate car moving back towards the muscle? If you can drive that back towards the muscle, then the fat cells start to deflate. The belly fat and the waistline goes down. We no longer overload the liver. So we stop making fat in the liver, and the fat becomes clear. The fatty liver becomes clear, and triglycerides go down as well. So that at a high level is really what I mean by insulin resistance. I know I spent some time on the slide, but this is a central understanding. I will tell you, I have a lot of patients that are physicians from all over the world. 95% of them do not understand insulin resistance at a very deep level like this. So I think for everyone, this is a really key concept for you to understand. Now, when we talk about insulin resistance, we call this talk type 2 diabetes, but I want you to understand that insulin resistance, based on emerging research, is intimately connected to brain function. So much so that we're finding a very strong linkage between insulin resistance and neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease. The link is so strong that now they're calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. And the reason for that is when your body's producing so much insulin because it can't get the carbs into that parking lot, that insulin actually prevents your brain from clearing out a substance called amyloid. And amyloid is the plaque that accumulates at the brain in the Alzheimer's disease. Look at bullet 4. Diabetics are 50% more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than non-diabetics. So really, diabetes, before I just worried about heart disease, but now talking to specialists from all over the world, we're finding extremely strong linkages between diabetes and Alzheimer's, and not just Alzheimer's, but other cognitive dysfunction. So memory loss, other types of dementia are being intimately linked to insulin resistance because it really does affect the metabolism and physiology of the brain. there's also a very strong linkage between insulin resistance and cancer. And the reason for that is when your muscles can't clear glucose effectively, I tell people that cancer cells are like humans. They like to eat sugar. So when there's more sugar in the blood, cancer cells can grow more aggressively. And that's why there's some studies about how low carb or ketogenic diets can slow down cancer progression, because that is really a key nutritional feeding source for cancer cells. So another linkage that we see between insulin resistance and that. And then the last one I want to sort of go over is a really common condition. So any of you that have daughters or women in your life who are South Asian, every single one of you needs to know about the condition polycystic ovarian syndrome. I know it's a mouthful. We abbreviate that PCOS. And many of the women in my practice, they never realized that they had this condition when they were young girls and teenagers. It's a devastating condition because number one, it causes acne, it causes facial hair. I had friends growing up that were teased by other boys because they had this condition. So emotionally, a lot of teenage girls and young girls develop severe depression from this condition. And then later on in life, they develop infertility and a very high risk of diabetes and heart disease. This is almost a separate talk in itself. But for those of you that have girls or women in your life, know this condition. And I put the bit.ly link because I did a very detailed presentation on, or a blog post on PCOS. It's at bit.ly/Sinha PCOS. The good news is you can reverse and prevent PCOS with the proper lifestyle changes. So please be aware of this condition, really important. Now, inflammation and insulin resistance, they can present at various stages of life. So basically what I'm showing in this diagram, when you see this couple here, when I give a lot of talks to Silicon Valley, often they have me give talks to young people who are planning on getting pregnant, couples. And I tell them often our lifestyle and behaviors before we even have kids, if we're more sedentary and inactive, both the mother or the father, during pregnancy, the types of foods that we consume, they can already program. We call this fetal programming. Literally, the woman's body can already start writing code for diabetes and obesity while we're in the fetal stage based on what we eat. So, when I wrote the book, I actually put a dedicated chapter on pregnancy because we see so much. We have parts of the Bay Area here where gestational diabetes is occurring in 40 to 50% of the Indian female population. That is astounding. 1 in 2 Indian women developing gestational diabetes, which means their risk of future diabetes is higher. The risk of their kids developing diabetes, heart disease throughout their life is higher as well, too. And some of that, quite frankly, is because of a lot of the cultural myths that we live behind. So I see Indians and Westerners in my practice. I'll give you one example. During a typical Indian woman pregnancy, if the mother's with the family or the mother-in-law is visiting, they typically tell women to basically sit during bed rest. There are all types of foods that we serve pregnant women that are supposed to give them more energy, but they're really very high carbohydrate foods. And the lack of physical activity is already setting them up and their future children for diabetes and obesity later on. It's a tough message to swallow into stomach because there can be a lot of family pressure behind this. But when you look at my Western population, I have to slow them down because they're training for marathons up till the 3rd trimester. So sometimes they're the other extreme, but they usually have incredible outcomes with pregnancies and things. So we really have to make sure our community understands, especially at the seed stage, that we have to implement the right types of lifestyle changes. So when I see couples in the clinic, I tell them, if you're deciding to have children, you have to train for that pregnancy, both of you, because the paternal genes play a role too. You train for that like you're training for a marathon or the most important event of your life. You can't just be sitting in front of a computer, stressed out, eating the wrong foods, doing all these things, because that's going to affect the code, the genetic blueprint of your future children. Okay, so how do we assess these health risks? Different categories. We're going to go through some lab tests and numbers so you can interpret your own numbers the next time you get your blood test done. The genes can definitely be a factor as well too. And then we're going to focus on the appropriate lifestyle changes. So I mentioned triglycerides to you. So just to summarize again, triglycerides are the storage form of fat inside the cells. So let me just show you a quick graphic here. It is an early sign of insulin resistance, which I defined as being that carbohydrate traffic problem. Triglycerides are also an early trigger to atherosclerosis, which is the process that forms the heart attack causing plaques. So again, when you look at the image on the right, the red tube is your blood cells. The yellow beach ball is the fat cell. So when the fat swells up with triglycerides, that's really what the triglycerides are. They're the storage form of fat. And I tell people at a high level, when we actually create the right lifestyle changes, we want to get that balloon to deflate. We want the triglycerides to actually get converted into a substance called free fatty acids. And when those enter the blood, they can travel to the brain and provide the muscles and brain with a lot of energy. So this reaction, we want it to go north. We want it to go from the overfilled fat cells into the blood, so then we can actually deliver energy to the muscles and to the brain as well too. Now, cholesterol, there's a few things I want you to understand about cholesterol, and this is super important. So when I was trained in medical school, we were always told to focus on the LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, right? You can think of L as being the lousy, it stands for low density lipoprotein. And this is actually a big, big fallacy when South Asians get their labs checked by doctors, because many Indians who have severe heart disease actually have low LDLs, but it's a dangerous type of LDL that can trigger heart disease. So let me just tell you at a high level, when you get a standard cholesterol test done, they will give you one single number under the LDL. So just remember, for the LDL cholesterol, they give you one number, but there's two types of LDL. There's a type A and a type B. And what LDL particles are, they're like boats that float in the water that carry cholesterol. That's why I'm showing you an image from my book of boats basically that are carrying cholesterol. Now, the type B LDL is the smaller boat, the one on the left in this animation here. And the smaller boats, even though you would think that the smaller boat would be less dangerous, the smaller ones are very sneaky. They're the ones that basically go into your blood vessel wall, they anchor in there, and then they cause the plaque to form inside your blood vessels. So the more of the type B, and think of type B as being bad, the more type B LDLs you have, the greater chances that these cholesterol particles will crash into your blood vessel wall and cause a heart attack or the stroke-causing plaques to form. Now, even if you don't get an advanced cholesterol profile done, look at the last point that I starred. If you looked at your last triglyceride, if your triglycerides are over 150, you're almost guaranteed. And if they're above 200, I can tell you with almost 100% certainty that you have mostly the type B LDL. So one of our goals is, if we can bring the triglycerides down, over time, that type B starts to actually shift into the type A, which can still be dangerous in abundance, but it's not as dangerous as a type B. So just remember type B for bad. Okay. So now let's put all this together, because I know I already gave you a lot of information. Let's pause and put these numbers into action so you can understand how to interpret your levels. So this is a sample study. I just changed the names, but Ed is a 32-year-old venture capitalist who came to see me after his first heart attack 6 months ago. He has a body mass index of 22, so he's fairly thin based on BMI criteria. He's got a normal blood pressure, non-smoker, exercises 5 days a week, and he was told his lipids are not concerning by his last doctor. So now with the information I gave you, let's go through his results. Again, his doctor was not really concerned. So you can look in the middle column at the sample results, and the sample results, and actually, let me just pull up my pen here. I think I can do this here. Okay. So sample results here, again, total cholesterol right here, 190. Now, most lay people and even lay doctors think that if your total cholesterol is less than 200, you're fine. I actually put here that it's actually not that important. I actually don't pay attention to total cholesterol. I think it's a very misleading number. Now let's move to LDL. Most labs will say less than 130, maybe less than 100 is normal. So based on that standard metric, it looks like Ed's lab of LDL looks okay. The HDL is low. Okay, HDL for men, we want it to be above 40. For women, we want it to be above 50, but it still doesn't get enough attention. Again, people are very LDL focused, but in his case, the LDL is low. Now let's talk about where the money is here. Okay, the triglycerides. Now, most lab reports will say that less than 150 is normal. Actually, some labs even say less than 300. I've seen lab reports from India where they use a cutoff of 500. So literally, if you have a triglycerides of 499, these doctors would tell you, don't worry about it, you're fine. But most heart disease I see in the 200s. 200s or above, very high risk of heart disease later on. So here, Ed has a 250, as you can see here. So definitely high. Now, here's the important part. Instead of looking at absolute numbers, you want to pay attention to ratios. So most lab reports will report a total cholesterol to HDL ratio. That's just your total cholesterol divided by your HDL. And we want that to be less than 4. This came in at 5.9. Now, here is a number that most labs will not report. And I want you to remember this number. This is a life-saving number. It's the triglyceride to HDL ratio. So you take the triglycerides of 250, you divide by 32, and you've got 7.8. It should be less than 3, the lower the better. I have seen so many patients that have come to me and they had a heart attack that could have been prevented, but because doctors focused on the LDL and the total cholesterol, it was not flagged. These ratios were off the charts. So if your ratios are above the limits that I talked about, you need to aggressively make lifestyle changes. Don't let your cardiologist or your doctor pat you on the shoulder and tell you you're fine. Even if you're taking cholesterol medications, you still have insulin resistance running rampant through your body. That parking problem is a major factor that we need to fix. So keep that in mind. Okay, so now what about the location of fat? So this is something I talk about. Why are South Asians so high risk? So one of the interesting things we find is Asians in particular, East Asians and South Asian, Asian Indians, we don't tend to be as overweight and obese as other ethnic groups like African Americans, like Caucasians, but our incremental heart disease risk is so much higher. And the way I want to describe this is by telling you that there are two major types of body fat in the body. And I actually kind of represent this. This is probably not a very diabetes appropriate slide here, but let's use a jelly donut here, okay? So with the jelly donut, the middle is basically that red jelly is what we call the visceral inflammatory fat. And remember early on, I said that inflammation is a process we don't want running haywire. The outer crust of the donut is the subcutaneous fat. So that's the fat that contributes to most of your body mass and weight. Now, when you look at the different ethnic groups here, look at the crust to jelly ratio. So Caucasians, for example, they have a relatively even split between the crust and jelly. African Americans have less of the jelly, but they have a lot more of the subcutaneous weight contributing mass, which is why they can be very heavy and high in body mass index. Look at Asians, though. This is East Asians and Asian Indians as well. We don't have as much of the subcutaneous body fat, the weight contributing body fat, but we have a high proportion of the inflammatory jelly. And that is why I often see Indians in my practice who are normal weight or underweight. They're skinny, their arms and legs are thin. They think they got the lucky gene. They can go out and eat as many gulab jamuns and chapatis, whatever they want, they can eat. They're like, I'm okay. But what they don't realize is all those foods are being stored invisibly inside their organs. So even though they seem underweight and they got the lucky gene, they actually got the most unlucky gene. And some of my patients in the clinic that have the highest triglycerides and the most plaque in their arteries are very skinny South Asians that have just a little bit of a pot belly. They look deceptively normal body weight. And a lot of doctors that don't know this look at them and they think, hey, no problem at all. They look at their cholesterol numbers. Hey, your LDL's fine. Little do they know that they have tons of the type B LDL. So this is what I want you to really be aware of, is that ratio of the fat, basically, very key. So here's another really illustrative slide here. What you're seeing here in the center are two world-renowned obesity researchers, a British guy on the left, a skinny guy from Pune on the right, Yajnik and Yudkin. And you can see they're at an Indian wedding. You can see the saris in the back there. So they're sitting at this Indian wedding. They both have identical body mass index, and body mass index is a ratio between your height and weight. So they have the same body mass index. But we also got DEXA scans. These are images of DEXA scans. And DEXA scan basically is used to screen for osteoporosis. It's also a great way to measure your body fat. So you can see that the skinny Indian guy who looks so much lighter and thinner than the guy on the left, his body fat is 21% versus the British guy who's 9%, right? And you can see in the image of the Indian guy on the right, look at all the dark purple through the body. That's all that fat, which you don't see on the outside, but it's all on the inside basically, right? So again, looking at somebody on the outside, you cannot tell what their risk is going on in the inside. I gave you some lab markers that can help you uncover some of that. And then this is a compelling image that really makes that point even more clear. So, you know, there are ways to look at waistline targets. So if you look at the World Health Organization tables and things, you can look these up and Google these. There's different images, different cutoff points for different ethnic groups, but really being more waist focused and weight focused is a really important way for you to identify that additional risk. Waist to hip ratios too are another way, but even if you're not going to do all these ratios, typically doctors should be measuring these, but I know it's not always convenient. But you know, when my patients make the right lifestyle decisions, I tell them more than looking at the scale, look at your pant size. Is your belt size getting better? Is your waistline of your pants getting looser? That's a sign that we're targeting things the right way. Okay. So now, one other key point I wanted to make is there is a gender disparity in fat distribution. I want to bring this up because often I will see couples in the clinic and the wives get very frustrated because they go on the same diet and the husband loses weight so rapidly and the female often doesn't lose any weight or they end up gaining weight. So why is that so unfair? Why do we have this gender inequity when it comes to dieting and metabolism? Well, one thing I want to tell you is, remember I told you that when the muscle doesn't accept the carbohydrates, the carbs get rerouted to fat. Now, that split in what type of fat it goes to varies often based on your sex. So you can see in men, often that carbohydrate goes more towards the visceral inflammatory fat. In women, especially before menopause, it goes more to the weight gaining fat. So it's very common for me to see a couple where the woman is maybe 30, 40 plus pounds heavier than the husband, and she gets very upset. Why is he so skinny? But when I actually do a cardiovascular risk assessment and I look at glucose and lipid numbers, I tell her that, listen, I know he's lighter than you, but he's not going to live very long if we don't make the right changes, because all of this his fat, it's not contributing to the scales, but it's in all the wrong locations. Now, for women, as they're approaching menopause, now the distribution starts to shift. So often during perimenopause and after menopause, women can start taking on the same risks as men in terms of insulin resistance and fat distribution. But this helps you sort of understand why there is sort of that gender disparity. Now, a couple of things. We are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I just want to highlight a couple of key points here. I know you guys are all reading the headline news. India sort of thought they were out of the woods with this. And it's really, it's tragic seeing what's happening in India, Brazil, and other parts of the world. But one thing to really understand is that inflammatory fat in the belly, that actually contributes to increased inflammation. So inflammation is a word that I used early on, and there's a type of inflammatory chemical that now a lot of people are familiar with called cytokines. You might have heard of the term cytokine storm. So people that are having the more severe outcomes with COVID-19, it's because their body's generating too many of those inflammatory cytokines. And keep in mind, there's a very strong link. This has been shown in studies worldwide between belly fat and cytokine storm. So even if you have not been infected with the COVID-19, just having extra belly fat will already cause the cytokine levels to go up. And then those individuals, if they get an infection, the chance of them having a very exaggerated, intense, toxic inflammatory firestorm is much higher. So this is one more motivator for my patients. I tell them we want to get metabolically healthy, not just to avoid diabetes, Alzheimer's, everything else we talked about, but also to avoid the complication from pandemics as well, too, because these viruses tend to really prey on people that have that extra fat. And I sort of call this term covicity. So to understand the link and the science behind this, I put the bit.ly link here, but it really gives you more information about what to do about the belly fat and how that's really linked to type 2 diabetes. Okay, so just to summarize, insulin resistance signs and risk factors. We talked about a few of these already, but just to summarize real quickly. We talked about increased waist circumference, the high triglycerides. We want to aim for less than 100, the low HDLs, the elevated blood glucose. High blood pressure is also associated with insulin resistance. There's some at-risk conditions, and we see these very commonly in South Asians, things like gout, which is a painful form of inflammatory arthritis. I mentioned fatty liver. As a refresher, PCOS stands for polycystic ovarian syndrome. You know, a lot of Indians have these dark skin folds around their neck. We call that condition acanthosis nigricans, and that's basically a marker of insulin resistance as well, too. And then we talked about gestational diabetes, and then I put a list of high-risk ethnicities. So these are all clues. Now, you might be asking, isn't there just a simple blood test that we can do? Unfortunately, no. I mean, you can check a fasting insulin level. If it's high, there's probably a good chance you are insulin resistant, but typically you have to do much more of a holistic survey and look at various factors to identify, A, do you have insulin resistance? And B, how severe is that insulin resistance? So this is a list of some of those factors you can look at. Now, how do we overcome this problem? I alluded to this a little bit when we went through it, but we need to basically get the carbs moving back towards the muscle parking lot. So one key concept I want you to understand from this is our muscles have fixed limited parking space on a daily basis. Okay, so they can only hold so many carbs. So that's why I put in red, we need to learn how to create more parking space. If we have muscles that are sitting in front of a computer, looking at Zoom meetings all day, and they're not exercising adequately, we're not creating space, because the way to create space inside that muscle is by exercising. That will clear out the glucose traffic. So many of my patients get frustrated because they're like, you know what, I'm watching my calories, I'm not eating much. Why am I gaining weight and becoming diabetic? Because they're thinking that by not exercising and just controlling the diet, they can fix the problem. But here's the issue. If I say, and we'll talk about the numbers in a little bit more detail, for most Indians, if they're eating more than 100 or 150 grams of carb a day, they typically fill up their muscle parking lot. So let's say you ate a low to medium carbohydrate diet and you filled up your parking lot, you're feeling pretty good, you didn't eat too much excess stuff, but you didn't exercise adequately. When you wake up tomorrow morning, guess what? I wish God made us in a way that there's a reset button and you wake up and every morning you have an empty parking lot. You are still, when you wake up in the morning, you have a full parking lot. So if you have one slice of whole wheat toast, a simple biscuit, the Indian favorite cereal, which is honey bunches of oats, which every Indian has in their pantry, including all of you on this webinar, right? So everybody, if you have the healthiest carbohydrate, but your parking lot is full, there is no space for the carbs to go. There's no valet parking space for whole wheat chapatis or steel cut oats. There is no space. So here in Silicon Valley, I'm finding that my Indians that are developing heart disease, diabetes, many of them have personal chefs. They're not having pizza, Coke, and mithai. They're getting diabetes from too much steel cut oats, too much whole wheat, whole grain wheat, too much quinoa, too much of the good carbs are filling up their parking lot. They're not exercising. They're not emptying and creating space. And that's why we get in this problem. So creating more parking space means you've got to reduce the input of traffic, but you also have to exercise to clear out that parking space. That's really critical. That's going to prevent the liver congestion. The liver is really the epicenter of so much of these diseases. It's going to help you lose the body fat. With the body fat, I said, again, reducing carb traffic. We'll go through some of the more nutritional strategies. Also highlighting stress, especially in women, can be very fat storing as well too. Women don't realize this, but increased emotional stress can prevent the body from releasing fat cells as well too. Really key point. Now, insulin resistance, I often say, comes from inner resistance. A lot of us, these are the common things I hear in the clinic of why we can't reverse insulin resistance. I don't have time right now, but we'll change when things get easier. I said that when my kids were newborn twin boys. They're 17. Guess what? Life has not gotten easier. If anything, it's gotten harder in a lot of ways, right? I'll wait until the kids get older. Once my startup takes off, then I'll focus on my health. Wrong. I take care of CEOs, investors, and VCs. They're some of the unhealthiest people I've ever met in my life, right? So don't even fool yourself with that one. Diabetes is in my family. I can't escape it. Let me enjoy life. Why bother? I talked about the fact that genetics is a very small factor. You can absolutely reverse most of these conditions. My parents lived a long life, so my genes should protect me. And that often is the case. I've, patients that come in, they tell me, hey, my parents, they're in their 80s, they're doing great, or grandparents are fine. But guess what? Your parents were not sitting in front of a computer all day. They were eating more natural foods, not all this processed junk. So they basically, you've inherited maybe an aberrant tendency towards insulin resistance, but it's a reverse case where they actually had primitive, healthier lifestyles that basically kept those apps off. And then eating a lot of carbs is part of my culture. I can't avoid it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying to ban carbs altogether, but it has to be the right amount that is compatible with your level of physical activity. That's the critical point here. Okay. And I want to make that point even more clear because I get this from my Indian and Chinese patients who get very mad at me. They're saying, why are you taking away my dosas, my rice, my noodles? I'm not taking it away. I just want to make a high level point here. Okay. So I'm from Calcutta. I'm Bengali. And I would go to India almost every summer. And I was really fascinated by rickshaw pullers. I'd love watching rickshaw pullers all the time. Now, rickshaw pullers, as an example, they run about 40,000 steps a day. Okay. They're carting around heavy, overweight families and loads. So they have a very strong leg and core. They have normal vitamin D levels because we get vitamin D from the sun. Vitamin D is actually linked to insulin resistance and inflammation as well, too. They have no issues with vitamin D deficiency because they're out in the sun, usually in a tank top, often shirtless. For them, eating lots of rice, almost unlimited amounts of rice is okay because their muscles are constantly in demand of that fuel. Now, let's compare this to a typical software engineer or a sedentary worker. I often do measure their steps based on their Fitbit or their Apple Watch. On average, they get between 2,000 to 3,000 steps. They're 20 times less active than a physical person like a rickshaw puller. They have a very weak leg and core, which is why they develop low back pain and all types of issues because they're slumped over a computer all day. Their vitamin D levels tend to be very low because they're indoors all the time. They're rarely outside. And if they are, they're fully clothed. So in that context, eating lots of rice, can be very dangerous, right? Because you are insulin resistant and the muscles can't handle it. Now, I'm not telling you to quit your tech jobs and become rickshaw pullers, but there is a happy medium in between where if we move a little bit to the left, we can already start reversing a lot of these health conditions. Okay, so let me give you a typical example. So this is a typical vegetarian Indian meal by a woman that I saw in the clinic. And this is actually literally a snapshot from my book. And what I mentioned to you earlier is normally when we start to exceed 100, especially 150 grams of net carb, and net carb means your total carbs minus the grams of fiber, that's when we basically overflow that muscle parking lot. And you can see Sumita's meals here. They don't sound bad at all. She's having one roti land bran chapati. That's got 24 grams of net carb, 4 grams of protein, 1 cup of cooked lentils, 1 cup of cooked aloo sabji. So from a fat and calorie perspective, this is not a whole lot, right? But when you add up the net carbs, it's 94 grams of net carbs in just one meal. And for most of my patients to succeed and overcome insulin resistance, they should be closer to 100 or below. So if she's eating this 2-3 times a day, plus you add on the snacks in between, it's not uncommon to see my South Asians consuming 300 to 400 grams of carb per day. Now, I take care of some elite athletes in my practice. I don't restrict them. They can take 400 to 500 grams of carb because they're training constantly. They're athletes. Their muscles need the carbohydrates actively. My twin boys, they can consume more carbs than I can because they're growing vertically and they're physically active. So this is not a hard rule for everyone, but the real message here is that for most of our lifestyles, we're over consuming that energy source of carbs way out of our capacity to really contain them. And then we have to be aware of certain things like vegetarians. So I tell people most of my Indian vegetarians are really not vegetarians. To me, a vegetarian isn't a non-meat eater. It's somebody who eats a lot of vegetables, right? So if you look at a typical Indian vegetarian thali, I always show this to people. Where are the vegetables here, right? It's rice, it's flatbreads, right? It's dal, it's lentils, it's starchy foods. And then we use a decorative, 2 cucumbers and tomatoes, which just sits in the tray in the corner there. But most of us are not eating adequate amounts of vegetables to be a true vegetarian or whatever, vegetarian, right? So a lot of us are eating Asian vegetarian meals, maybe Mexican vegetarian. Again, the proportion of starches to protein is extremely high. So that's something we need to balance out. So let's talk about some ways to do that. So early on, when I first wrote the book, even the concepts of cauliflower rice were very foreign. I was teaching people how to use a food processor and a grater to make that. Now, thank God, almost in every store you can find this. So I tell people, start making carb copycats. Be very familiar with making cauli rice, zucchini pasta. These are vegetables that are prepared in ways so they're disguised as carbohydrates. And when you start to do that, you're lowering your daily carb intake by 50, 70, 80 plus grams per day. It is a game changer because you're not overwhelming that muscle parking lot anymore and you're starting to reverse the processes. So incorporating these carb copycats is a really powerful tool. Now, a big question comes up because I know nutrition headlines are so confusing. Everybody seems to be all over ghee and coconut oil. One moment saturated fat's good, the next moment it's bad. Where the heck do we settle on this, right? And I wish I had a simple answer for you. And unfortunately, my answer is going to be, it depends. A lot of it depends on our genes. I put the names of some of the genes here, but what I found in my practice is there are some individuals can handle ghee and coconut oil and eggs fine, and their cholesterol is great. They lose weight, they reverse insulin resistance. Others, they can't go hog wild and eat these things like crazy because I see that their body weight and their cholesterol goes up. So in most people, you have to be a little bit careful. I think in most people, saturated fat doesn't have to be banned. Most people, they have to be a little careful because if they get a little bit too much beyond their capacity, kind of like we said with the carbs, then we can start seeing those numbers go haywire. And one way for you to test this, you don't have to go out and get genetically tested, is make the dietary changes, check your baseline cholesterol first, make the dietary changes, and then check them in 3 to 4 months and see how the numbers look based on that. Many of my patients, I feel like they're eating too much of the fats, but their numbers look great. I'm not going to change much over there. But if we do see the numbers going in the wrong direction, then we have to make the appropriate changes. I think in general, though, as much as the debate goes on between saturated fat, one thing I will tell you, I do agree that saturated fat is not as bad for our health as I used to think, but saturated fat cannot be arguably considered heart protective because we just don't have the data that we do on things like omega-3s and Mediterranean oils and fats like olive oil. So I tell people, just like with our finances, you want to diversify your fat intake. So emphasize those evidence-based heart-healthy fats like the olive oil, avocados, nuts, and seeds, omega-3s. If your diet allows it, get it through fish. If you're vegetarian, you can't do fish, flax-based type omega-3s. Definitely for everyone, want to eliminate the hydrogenated trans fats. You want to limit the seed-based omega-6 oils, which I listed. A lot of these are ones that many of my Indians are cooking with on a regular basis. You want to use well-sourced saturated fat in moderation, and then check your cholesterol results just to make sure you're not particularly saturated fat sensitive. Okay, quick point here. I know most of us probably know that liquid sugar is an issue. Before the pandemic, again, I'm not a family practice doctor, but I have started seeing some teenagers in my practice, and things like milk tea boba, Starbucks frappuccinos, juices, sports drinks, sodas became a big issue. And I mentioned to them that many of the drinks that our kids are consuming, they're coming out to be multiple. I mean, these drinks that I'm outlining, 4 grams of sugar in one sugar cube, and you can see the number of sugar cubes that are in one serving. So we got to be really careful as adults and our kids. What are they consuming? And many of these also have fructose inside them. So be really aware of fructose. You might know that this is bad for you, but coming back to my mechanism here, the reason fructose is so bad is because the body sends it straight to the liver. It literally gets converted directly into triglycerides, okay, and causes fat storage in the liver. So be sure you're aware of the processed fructose in your diet. I put lists of foods here. I highlighted for sweeteners. One of the biggest mistakes people make is they like to use the agave syrup because it sounds so healthy. And I put here that agave has more fructose than high fructose corn syrup. So food labels are very misleading. I hate to mention this, but so many of the snack foods, right, that we buy from our Indian grocery stores and things, they have the wrong types of oils. Many of them are filled with fructose, so they're poison for the liver. So really be careful with these types of foods. They can really trigger these types of metabolic changes. So our nutritional prioritization is ban processed fructose sources first. I think they're the worst for you. Ban the liquid sugar sources next. Use the carb copycats to lower that overall net carb intake, and then focus on the nutritional density of meals and snacks. So really, some of you might have seen this sort of diagram before, but if you want to keep things simple, your plates, your bowls should be predominantly vegetables. They don't have to be salads. They can be your sabji with colorful vegetables. I know a lot of Indians don't like to eat salads. They can be lightly cooked vegetables and sabjis with multiple colors. Some of my Indians are just eating the same 2 or 3 vegetables with almost all their sabjis. And I tell them, incorporate different types of colors. Have a corner in that plate or bowl with some fibrous grains. Don't forget about the healthy fats because they can have powerful anti-inflammatory effects. And then have a corner for healthy proteins. The most common question I get from my vegetarians are, Dr. Sinha, I don't know how to get more protein in the diet. There's not enough sources. There are tons of sources. I'd say more than half the patients in my clinic are vegetarians. I did a dedicated blog post on how to get right amounts of protein in your diet. I put that at the bit.ly link there, and I put a list here as well too. The protein is absolutely essential. Now, one other trick I want to teach you real quickly too is when you consume carbohydrates alone, a bowl or plate of white rice, your glucose goes up very sharply, okay? Very sharp, steep spike. But whenever you take a carbohydrate and you combine it with proteins and healthy fat and vegetables, you literally, to use an overused term, you're flattening the curve. It is not going to go up as abruptly. So when I tell my Indians who love their rice, I tell them, listen, I'm not telling you to quit rice, but can you eat it more biryani style? Okay, so eat it smaller amount of rice. If you eat meat, you can add chicken, fish to it. If you don't, add nuts, seeds, vegetables, maybe paneer to that. Dilute out the effects of just pure carbohydrate by adding vegetables, protein, and fat to that. Sometimes the meal that I take to work with me is literally like a container, a dabba, basically. It's got a little bit of rice or quinoa. It's mixed with tons of vegetables and protein. I still get the aroma and the flavor of the rice, so I feel satisfied. I'm Bengali, right? We love to eat our rice, but I also have all the vegetables, protein, and fat to dilute out and neutralize a spike from that. You can apply that to any starchy foods. If it's dal's a great source of protein, but it's got 3 times as much carb per unit of protein weight. So I tell people, make a vegetable dal, add, spinach to it, add gobi to it, add some healthy oil and fat to it instead of just plain dal. Other foods, ethnic foods, you apply this. If you love pasta night, make it pasta primavera, right? Smaller amounts of pasta, but add vegetables to it, olive oil, add a little bit of cheese to that, have a salad with that on the side. That's going to be a better meal than just having empty carbohydrates. I'm not banning carbs from your diet. I'm asking you to rethink and re-engineer those meals to incorporate the right nutrients so it's more balanced and not just mostly empty starches throughout the day. You will not only lose weight, you will feel much better from that as well. Now, exercise, I want to quickly cover here too. I know we started a little bit later, so we'll definitely get through this in time to open up for questions. But really the process of interrupting prolonged sitting, I don't know if you can tell right here, I'm standing right now. And I'm not saying that you have to stand continuously, but put into place a workflow that allows you to basically interrupt prolonged sitting as often as you can. Coming back to cytokines, multiple studies show that prolonged sitting for more than 45 minutes, more than an hour, triggers increased cytokine release. And that can lead to more increased body fat, glucose, blood pressure, all the things that we've talked about. I tell people to implement a strategy that is referred to as exercise snacking, where you actually snack on movement throughout the day. The more lightly active you can be throughout the day, the more your body's going to burn fat, the more blood sugar is going to go down, the more energetic you're going to feel. And let me show you how I teach my Silicon Valley employees to do this. So I tell them when you are exercise snacking, you're going to do a couple of different things. You're going to stock the pantry, you're going to visit the pantry, and then you're going to snack on movement. So what do I mean by this? So stock your pantry with a variety of different movements. So I put a few of these here, basically. You can see in the top left, I'm standing at a stand-up workstation doing my work. That fabric band that you see there is a resistance band. So I'm spreading my legs out gently. I'm activating my core and my buttocks and my quads and things. So I'm actually getting some active work done there. And the one in the top right, I call this a high pigeon. I'm lifting my thigh up while I'm doing some work to kind of open up my hips. And then sometimes I will actually ride my exercise bike while I'm going through emails. So figure out what sorts of things can keep your body in motion rather than just being frozen, seated in front of a computer all day. And not only are you going to improve your numbers, you're going to feel like a different person. Really key. This bit.ly link at the bottom, I'll provide the resource with you, has images of how I do this, but you might have some favorite activities, yoga postures, and moves that you can incorporate throughout the day. And that's the key here. It's not looking for that magical 30 minutes or an hour on the weekend or that evening walk. It's how do you intersperse activity throughout the day? And now that most of us are working from home, when you're in a Zoom meeting, you don't always have to be on video. I'm in a lot of Zoom meetings where I turn off the video, I'm listening to the meeting, I'm in a plank position, I'm doing a couple of squats, I'm doing that exercise snacking throughout the day. I'm trying to teach my kids to do that. They don't always listen, but it's a really important technique. Now, when you are doing more weight training type exercises, you want to engage large muscle groups, okay? Rickshaw pullers are doing squats every day. You can mimic that by using dumbbells or weights and just doing some squatting there. You can see the range of motion. I remember my grandmother in Calcutta, she can sit in that sort of squat position and make tea and breakfast for everyone in front of a low stove. We need to open up our hips. So doing what we call a sumo squat is really important. Sometimes if you got some light dumbbells at home, doing what's called a farmer's walk or suitcase carry can really optimize posture and create a lot of muscle strength. So these are simple things you can do without going to a gym that activate those essential muscles. And remember what I told you, when the large muscle groups are active, they can store and burn more carbohydrates. They reduce your risk of insulin resistance. Okay. Now, a couple of points are about aerobic fitness. Aerobic fitness is extremely important, but I'm going to give you a sort of a different way of thinking about aerobic fitness, some simple rules here, okay? So one thing I find in many of my exercising patients that often they are exercising at too high of a heart rate, too high of an intensity. And if you want to lower the risk of diabetes and heart disease, you actually want to exercise as an intensity that's what we call moderate dose, okay, moderate level. And that's a rate where we are basically mostly breathing through our nose and we can converse with little effort. So if you and I went for a power walk, we'd be breathing a little bit heavy, but we can still have a conversation. That is a sweet spot. Now, if you're a metrically driven person, you're wearing a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, typically you should not exceed 180 minus your age for most of your workouts. If you're 40 years old, most of your workouts, if you're on a Peloton, an exercise bike, 80% of your workouts should not exceed 140. I know it's going to seem like, wow, that's just too easy, but that is a sweet spot for burning body fat and reversing diabetes. And you want to do that at least 30 to 45 minutes most days of the week, 5 to 7 days a week if we can. That is the optimal dose. If you want to learn how to do this properly, I've got very specific details in this blog post that I have here. Now, one simple thing I teach people that is a marker. So it's interesting. People always tell me, you know, they're so obsessed with their glucose numbers, their cholesterol numbers. I tell them one of the numbers that's probably the most important when it comes to long life is how fast you can walk a mile. So if you have a neighborhood circuit that you walk that's a couple of miles, time yourself and see how fast you can walk. And then basically, as you're getting fitter and fitter, you should be walking that circuit a little bit faster. That's actually a better marker for long life than your cholesterol or your blood sugar, honestly. So be sure you're aware of that aerobic fitness level. Okay, I usually get a lot of questions on fasting, so I'm going to address a couple of these here, and then there might be some additional questions during the Q&A. But this is very popular right now. We either call it intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating. And if you do it properly, it can be very effective. So first thing is you can start by shaving off 1 to 2 hours from your eating. So when we say intermittent fasting, what are we saying? We're saying basically how many hours are you eating and how many hours are you not eating? So 14-10 basically means that you're not eating for 14 hours, including sleep, and you're eating during a 10-hour window. 16-8 means basically you're not eating for 16 hours and your window is basically eight hours of eating, right? So if you're eating from, let's say, 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., that's an 8-hour window. Then you're sleeping, and the rest of the time, that's fasting. Now, a couple of key things. I know this is very tough for Indians, but for most of them, I tell them, try to finish your eating by 7:30 p.m. latest, because when we eat beyond that, insulin is not as effective. Our digestive hormones have gone to sleep. So things don't go towards the muscle game, they go more towards the fat and the liver. So really try to finish that meal earlier and see if you can compress that eating window so you get longer periods of fast. The other benefit of fasting too is it gives the liver more rest to clear out the extra triglycerides and the glucose as well. Okay. Now, I want to summarize one last thing here is my own data here, okay? This is why I'm so passionate about this, because back in 2009, and I'm going to pull up my pen here too, so this is clear. All right, so you can see here in 2009, I'm going to circle here at the top. Now that you guys are experts on cholesterol. Now, when I saw a doctor back then, he told me that my total cholesterol looked great. You can see it's 154. It's a second number right here. But look at my triglycerides. There were 314 and my HDL is 28. Luckily, I knew about this. So look at my ratio, 11.2. And if you remember, the cutoff should be less than 3. I had the LDL of 85, which looks really good and normal. But look, I've got the type B, right? The bad type. So this is really my numbers in action. And then after I made the lifestyle changes over time, you can see that my ratio dropped down to 1.6. So that's nicely well below the 3. You can see the triglycerides are at 74. The HDL has gone up to 47. So these are the lifestyle changes I recommend through all of my work in my clinic on talks, so we can shift these ratios in the right direction. For me, the culprit meal was my breakfast. At that time, I was not as metabolically fit. So just having steel cut oats and banana, that was like 50 grams of net carb. But then I switched to a higher protein option, dropped it down to 3 grams for that meal, made a huge difference with my numbers. So these are the types of changes we're really looking to make. Okay, so let me just get to a few last things. I mentioned the word inflammation. Okay, so is there a simple way for us to check inflammation? Now, we don't recommend doing this in all patients, but I do sometimes track a test called the C-reactive protein, or the HSCRP, which is a highly sensitive C-reactive protein. This patient has had high inflammation for a very long time, 10.6. I aim for less than 1 if we can. So we dropped the CRP, or the inflammation, from 10.6 to 3.6 right here, okay? That was through dietary and exercise changes. But then we were able to take the inflammation down to 0.6. This patient felt like a new person when we did this. Now, what was the trick to doing this? There was a simple trick. It's called meditation. Yes, chronic stress is an inflammatory toxin. When you're constantly worrying and thinking about, things all the time, you're not doing mindfulness type practices, we will see the immune system get overactivated. And often, until I can get that activation under control, we don't see inflammation numbers and insulin resistance reverse. I wanted to show you the quantitative metrics behind that. Okay, and now finally, I know I keep saying finally, and I promise this is finally here. A few last points I want to make. I told you early on in this talk, we are seeing more kids nowadays. Our Indian kids are developing insulin resistance at record-breaking early ages. And many of them are actually suffering from a lot of emotional stress. And because I've done a lot of family sessions, I've actually done a lot of teen sessions, they continue to reach out to me, telling me sort of what they're going through. So I thought this quote from my Instagram page is something all of us should read and absorb, because we need to have a big picture in how we're parenting our kids. So this is a burned out executive on parenting, and I want to read this quote to you. I spent my whole life meeting my parents' goals, which at that time felt like my own. I got top grades. I won all the awards. I went to prestigious schools. I run my own company, but I sacrificed my mental and physical health and now find myself regretting my own career path. Did I do it all so my parents could earn bragging rights? Others may idolize me from the outside, but they don't know how I feel on the inside. Silicon Valley executive, right? So this is really big stuff. I'm going to skip over this one, but basically these are the types of talks I'm giving because we need to have more insight and awareness on the types of behaviors we're actually passing on to our kids who now already in high school and college are taking on the behaviors, they're developing the conditions. And if they're developing already in their teens, just imagine when they're in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, the risk is going to be incrementally higher, which is why I'm seeing heart disease in our South Asians in their 30s and 40s now, which is unheard of. So some of my resources here are listed. I also have a whole family health program. I put the link here. I'm giving more talks to schools and colleges and universities on this topic. It's very close to my heart. COVID-19, unfortunately, is still on our minds. This is a free ebook or resource book that teaches you the foods that are actually proven to shown to reduce the inflammatory side. We minimize our risk of COVID-19. All these things are mentioned in this ebook. So if you go to that link and put your email address here, I've had probably over thousands of people all over the world use this ebook as a wellness guide. So you're welcome to use this as a resource as well too. And then there's my blog and my Instagram there as well too. And with that, let's go ahead and move on over to the Q&A section. All right, let me erase this pen thing here. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we can move on to the Q&A.
Wow. Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha. It was just a perfect balance of sobering thoughts on diabetes and predisposition, but also very empowering ideas about diet and lifestyle.
Thank you.
We do have, as you can expect, a lot of questions. We try to get through them as many as we can.
Sure.
I've tried to categorize some of them so that they are not repetitive. So a few on predisposition, few on diet, and a few on lifestyle and exercise. So whenever you're ready.
I'm ready. Yep. Yeah.
So you talked about the insulin resistance. There is also, in terms of, as most people understand it, hypertension, cholesterol, diabetes, they all go together. Is that like a yes answer to that? Yeah, and is there the genetic predisposition? Is that the capsule in terms of predisposition?
Very, very good question. So when we think about insulin resistance as being sort of the root of the tree of all these conditions, the ones that are most tightly linked to insulin resistance are the obesity, the central obesity, the cholesterol, especially the triglyceride and the low HDL, the diabetes and the blood sugar. Now, hypertension also is linked because people that have insulin resistance, their blood vessels tend to be stiffer and the blood vessels also retain more fluid. So it is common for me to see people who reverse insulin resistance, often their blood pressure gets better. But I will say that blood pressure is a little bit more genetically linked. So when I see a single parent or two parents with hypertension, I even have some patients basically that are elite athletes, right? And they cannot get their blood pressure down to normal because they have such a strong history. Now, if you go to my blog and just put hypertension into the search, I did a very detailed post on high blood pressure. Aside from genetics, I would say there are a couple other factors that play a very strong role with high blood pressure. The first is sleep. The sleep issues that I see in my patients are really disturbing, and they're having interrupted sleep or they're going to bed very late at night. And when they fix their sleep and they're getting more rest and managing stress better, we can see that blood pressure come down. The second thing is vitamin D. I'm actually seeing quite a bit of linkages between very low vitamin D and blood pressure. And like I said, most of my South Asians have very low vitamin D levels. So if we can get that up through diet, through some natural sunlight exposure and supplementation is needed, often we can see that hypertension gets better too. Thanks.
Since you mentioned vitamin D, I'm going to skip to that.
Okay.
Before other questions, would vitamin D supplementation help, or are you recommending it across the board?
Oh, yes. So I would say, First of all, I think it's a good idea to get a baseline number checked. And then based on that number, you supplement appropriately. Now, again, talk to your doctor about that. But most of our Indians, they typically need a much higher dose than the typical population. Because if we have my skin tone or darker, you're going to need probably double to triple the amount that we recommend for, let's say, the general population. There's a standard guidelines out there. When you see a typical doctor, they're going to say you have low vitamin D, take over the counter at 1,000 or 2,000 units. That's usually not enough for my patients. They need to take closer to 4,000 to 5,000 units. So I would get a baseline level checked. And for most patients, they do have to end up, getting higher doses. Now, what I would tell you is vitamin D is a small factor. I usually don't see game-changing improvements in blood sugar. I don't see insulin resistance reversed because sometimes we become very medication focused. Maybe if I take vitamin D and magnesium and I take fish oil, I don't have to exercise. I wish that was the case because I would be doing the same thing. I'd rather not be exercising as much as I do. But these are what we call supplements. They're small things that might have an incremental benefit. I have Indians that come in with bags of supplements. They're taking cinnamon, they're taking turmeric, they're taking everything. But I've rarely ever seen somebody come in with a bag of supplements that has significant improvements on their numbers unless they're implementing lifestyle changes. That's sort of the macro picture with that.
Thank you. I guess it also depends on whether you live in sunny California or in New England.
Yeah, you would be surprised. I'm in sunny California, but again, if you're indoors all the time, or when you're outdoors, you're in a shirt, I see rampant vitamin D deficiency here too. So unless you're a lifeguard in Southern California on the beach, you're probably not going to be getting adequate doses. And to give you an idea, if you're somebody that doesn't want to take supplements, the way you know how to get enough vitamin D for most people is you have to be outdoor, because now summertime's coming up, we're going to get more sun. But to understand how much you need to actually get vitamin D is you'd have to be outdoor in the sun, and you take half of your burn time. And what that literally means is, if a person with white skin was out in the sun, they can start burning within 15 or 20 minutes, right? Because they don't have this dark pigment to protect them. So if you take half their burn time, they only need 10 minutes, okay? Half of the 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week is all they need. They do need to keep most of their body surfaces exposed. So short sleeve shirt, tank tops, and shorts. For us, often for Indians with our skin tone, it might take 40, 45 minutes or more for us to get burned where our skin gets very hot or red. So you have to take half of that time 3 to 4 times during the week. Most Indians are not going to be doing that, right? So it's just not tenable. So again, most things I like to do naturally, but I know for most Indians, it's not practical for them to get sufficient sun exposure to make up for them.
Thank you again. Right. So I'm going to sneak a couple of questions together so it's kind of get through.
Sure.
Age and gender. Does insulin resistance get worsen as we get older? And 2, do women have any specific predisposition? You kind of mentioned that already with pre and perimenopausal, but anything specific in terms of preventive lifestyle for
good point. Yeah. So let's talk about aging first. So absolutely. So unfortunately, what happens as we age, and this is why we have to stay ahead of the issue, is if we're not staying physically active, if we're especially not doing resistance training, muscle training type things, we do have a process called sarcopenia where we lose a little bit of muscle mass each year. And in Indians, I see that process is a little bit more accelerated. There's some genetic reasons why. So absolutely, as we age, if we don't stay ahead of the game by exercising, by doing some resistance training, and by modifying the diet, the insulin resistance will continue and get worse. So that's why, let's say, for the last 5 years, if you've been doing the same level of exercise, good for you. But if you want to stay ahead of it, especially after age 45, 50, the amount of muscle mass we lose start to incrementally get worse. We have to stay ahead of that through exercise. So I have Indian patients in their 70s who have taught them how to do squats, how to exercise in ways that can actually help prevent that. Because remember what I talked about, when you lose that muscle mass and strength, your parking lots get smaller. It takes very little carbohydrates to fill them in. That is related to the gender issue too. When you look at women versus men in general, regardless of ethnicity, women tend to have less muscle mass. When you look at worldwide studies of ethnic women, when you look at Indian women compared to other ethnic groups around the world, Indian women have the least amount of muscle mass out of almost every other ethnic group out there. Is startling. So I tell women, my Indian women in particular, you have to find a way to resistance train. I'm a fan of yoga, but people do different types of yoga. Yoga's great, but you have to make sure you're activating large muscle groups, you're strengthening the core. Some of my women were only able to lose weight and reverse insulin resistance by actually taking weight training classes. I know this isn't part of our culture, but literally learning how to lift up a heavy kettlebell, how to deadlift, doing large motions with heavier weights. It was game changing for them. That was the one missing part. They needed to increase protein in their diet too, but women do have to be aware of that basically, because that's one key factor for them. And yes, as we hit menopause, like we talked about, the risk starts to get high. Now, having said that, if women or girls are developing PCOS early on, or if mom had gestational diabetes, we have to be very, very on top of girls and women early on because their incremental risk is much higher. So that's where the family history makes a big difference. Great.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I think the two slides about the muscle and the parking as well as the visceral fat, we keep going back to that because it's like such a beautiful couple of slides that explains and actually gives the underlying mechanisms for the diet and the lifestyle that you propose.
Thank you.
So moving forward, exercise, there is a couple of interesting questions. One is, does the body adapt to the same type of diet and exercise as we go along? And two, is there any special benefit to, I would use a medical word, postprandial, meaning exercise after eating to bring the blood sugar down?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first question is alluding to, does your body sort of get used to the same type of exercise and diet over time? And some studies do seem to indicate that especially with exercise, if you're not challenging different muscle groups, the body can sort of get used to that. So to basically supercharge the metabolism, sometimes we do want to do different types of activity. I've seen enough science where it seems like that makes sense. I like to do a variety of things for a different reason. And that's because one of my number one goals as I exercise is I don't want to be in pain. I don't want to get injured. And I find that if I alternate between cycling on some days, running on others, hiking sometimes, when you alternate or cross train, you stay very active, energetic, and you're in less pain. And if you're in less pain every day, then you're going to end up exercising more often, because when you're in pain, like a lot of my Indian runners, I tell most of my Indian runners to stop running because they're not running with proper form. They have weak cores. They're training for 5Ks, half marathons and marathons. It's a matter of time before they injure themselves. They're better off doing a little bit of power walking, maybe a little bit of light jogging, maybe some bike riding, maybe some hiking. Just mixing it up, I think, makes the most sense. So that's really, really important for that. The second part of the question, it was a good question. It already slipped my mind. Tell me again the second part.
I think you kind of answered both. One was the adaptation of the body, and the second was specific exercises after eating. If you exercise.
Oh, yes. Oh, no. This is actually a good point. So there are benefits to exercising before. There's benefits to exercising after. So one thing, this is really important. I'm so glad this question came up, is if I know tonight, okay, so, one of the ways I plan for social eating, because I don't want to take your fun away from you. If it's Diwali, you've got holiday festivities, the way I enjoy these things. And literally today I'm doing this because I'm getting invited to someone for a patio get together. I know there's going to be food that I'm going to eat. I don't have good willpower. So I know tonight I'm going to be eating probably more carbohydrates than usual. So my typical limit is like 100 grams, okay? So basically that's like $100 in the bank. So I tell people, think of this like money. I don't want to overspend early in the day. So I've known all day that I'm going to be looking forward to this party. So that's why I didn't feel hungry in the morning. I didn't have breakfast. For lunch, it was more vegetables and protein. Now, on top of that, I did a vigorous exercise session already. The beauty is when you do exercise, especially exercise that involves the large muscle groups like your leg and core, now those muscles have a demand for energy. If I eat a bowl of rice after I've exercised vigorously, a large proportion of that energy is going to go to the muscles because the muscles want to pull that in because they've been actually worked. So I've done all those things. And the interesting thing is when you exercise, that demand can last for up to 24 hours. Okay. So that's pretty powerful. So that's one benefit of exercising before you eat. Now, if you ate something and you walked after that, or you did some exercise, you can bring that sugar down very rapidly. So the other tool that I use in my practice that makes that point, or often I will put patients on continuous glucose monitors. These are monitors that you basically slap on your skin. You know, we used to use it just in type 1 diabetics on insulin, but sometimes I'll just use in patients for behavior change. And you put that monitor on, and let's say you ate a big meal and you see your glucose going up, you literally go out for a 20-minute walk and you will see that curve start to drop down very rapidly. I'm not telling everybody to go out and get a sensor, but I will tell you, after doing this for many years, that's the number one motivator for a lot of my Indians to walk. Just knowing the signs that postprandial walk or any exercise after that can really help flatten out that curve. So really key strategy for mitigating some of the inevitable high carbohydrate eating we're going to end up doing throughout our daily life.
Thank you. I just want, this is just to clarify for the audience, the diet and exercise and lifestyle that you're proposing are not only to prevent diabetes, but also those who have already developed insulin resistance and frank diabetes type 2.
Exactly. So that first case study was literally somebody who had already developed it. I saw a patient a few weeks ago that had an A1C of above 14%, which means their average blood glucose is above 400. And over a 3 to 4 month period, we reversed the diabetes completely. That's the good news. So whenever patients come to see me, they've been exposed to my work, that is their goal and that's their expectation. But, you know, I will have to say that I can't predict who's going to have it reversed or not, because I've had people with decades of diabetes, we reverse it within months. I've had others that only had a year of diabetes. I was confident we could do it, but there are some stronger genetic factors or other metabolic issues that prevented us from complete reversal. But in almost all cases, if you could even slow down the diabetes from progressing and even partially reverse it, that's a game-changing improvement. In almost everyone, you can make significant changes, even if it's not full reversal. And that's a goal worth working towards.
So moving on to diet, I'm kind of combining a few questions here.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing these questions. You're doing a great job. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. We want to get through so that everybody gets their questions answered. And
Yeah.
I hope you can stay a little longer than 7:30.
I'm happy to. No problem.
Great. A lot of talks, at least talks centered on use of millets, especially in India. And Indian dietitians also recommend ghee and a couple of other items that the Western diets frown on. So any thoughts on that, especially millets and then the ghee part? That was the key question.
Great question. So with the millets, you know, I found generally that millet tends to be something that does not have as much impact on the glucose as other sources of carbohydrates and starches. So I think for most people, millets probably is fine. Now, the reason I'm just hesitating a little bit is because I've been doing this work for so long. It's a very individual thing. Like I've had patients that have used millets in their diet and their glucose is higher than they can handle. The same with chapati. So one thing, the millets, like I said, in most people is probably fine. It all comes down to quantity, but I want to move on to whole wheat for a second, because I want to tell you that in the old days, before I did this work, I was telling all my patients to go from rice to whole wheat chapatis. But after measuring sugars and glucose, I will tell you in most people, the whole wheat atta that we buy from the Indian store is basically brown sugar without the sweet flavor. It causes sugars to go up like nobody's business. So in many of my patients who are eating chapatis all day or rotis, you know, whatever you want to call them, I often find that, you know what, it's almost easier for you to do brown rice or even white rice, but made the way I talked about, where you mixed it with vegetables, protein, and fat. So really be aware of that. Now, the ghee, I've done a dedicated blog post on ghee, but I will say, you know, ghee has been a part of our ancient tradition. It's medicinal, right? It's part of Ayurvedic medicine. The one thing I want you to be aware of, though, is if you are going to have ghee on a regular basis, make sure it's well sourced. I know it's terrible to go into these health food stores and see that a bottle of ghee is like $12 or $14 when you can get it from an Indian store for so much cheaper. But you have to be careful, because if the ghee is not well sourced, it cannot be good. Now, many of us might be making ghee at home from good quality dairy. That's probably the best preferred source. But again, back to the saturated fat thing that I said, small amounts in moderation, even medium amounts for a lot of people, I have no issues with the ghee. Okay. But when people are using the ghee to fry, you know, foods and things like that, then the ghee becomes poison, because now you're combining carbohydrates with saturated fat. So that's another key point. When you hear headlines about ghee is great for me, coconut oil is good for you, if you take saturated fat and you combine it with high carbs, that is a double whammy. All of a sudden, the ghee or the oil that could be medicinal it becomes poison, because high carbs with excess saturated fat will drive more fat into the arteries and into the fat cells. So when I tell people you can introduce coconut oil and ghee, it should be in the context of a healthy diet where the carbs are restrained, you're physically active, so you're using some of that ghee for energy instead of just for fat storage. In that context, these can be very powerful foods, which is why Westerners and athletes now fuel themselves on ghee and coconut oil. It's part of their nutritional plan because they're doing it in a healthy context like that. So I'm sorry, I'm giving you very long-winded answers, but I'm very passionate about these topics. So I'm done with that one.
Perfect. It answers a lot of you're actually anticipating a lot more questions as well. So
Okay.
it's like the subtleties, not just the ghee, it's not just the ingredient, but how we use it and in what foods that we use.
Very well said. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So for the Kannada community, I think they're already thinking of a couple of sweets like Mysore Pak and Puran Poli that you may be familiar with. They are very typical of what you described, a combination of ghee and carbs. So
Right. Yeah, definitely. But there's a dietitian that I hired that works with me. You can get very creative. Like if you guys are sweet eaters and you like to, again, I'm Bengali, so I can relate to this stuff, but using like nuts, using a good quality ghee or coconut oil, using like almond flour, like there's different things that you can use for sweets. If you use like a coconut sugar, there's a lot of blogs and posts out there where people are using coconut sugar with maybe erythritol, which is a safe sweetener. You can find a lot of ways. Just look up low carb or keto Indian type sweets. You can do amazing things. My wife's really good at hacking Indian sweets. So, when seasons come up, she knows how to bake with ingredients that will not cause as much of an issue. And they taste really much like the real thing. Like, coconut-based sweets, we call them naru in Bengali, like using shredded coconut, using a little bit of ghee, using some nuts, you just mix that together, you can make a pretty good high quality snack. Now, the problem is when you buy them from the sweet shops, right? What sorts of oils are they using? How long is that oil? What's the age of that oil? Because when oil is old, that's when the problem is. When people tell me that they're eating low carb foods delivered by DoorDash or from restaurants, I'm like, great. But one of my biggest concerns is the only thing that's probably worse than the carbs is the types of oils that they use. If they're frying up dosas and stuff in the same oil and recycling that oil, the more they recycle that same oil, it becomes a toxin. Okay. Restaurants, most Indian restaurants, most restaurants in general are not using high grade oils. So the more we reheat those oils, they can cause inflammation in the body as well. I'm not banning restaurants, but don't think just by eating low carb at an Asian restaurant or an Indian restaurant, you're doing yourself a favor, because the oils might be doing more damage to the body.
So like you mentioned, sourcing is important as well.
Sourcing is so important. Exactly.
And, how do I control carb craving or sweet craving?
Good point. So this is something I've been very familiar with. So one of the reasons is to identify, first of all, when does that carb craving happens? For most people, it happens around the second half of the day, okay? 3, 4, 5 p.m., or when you come back from work, you feel like eating everything in the pantry in the fridge, right? I've been there. I know exactly what that sensation's like. And the reason for that is because in the morning, just because we're jumping into meetings, we're dealing with the kids and all that stuff, we typically tend to undereat. Most of us are not eating like protein for that first meal. We might skip the meal. This is what I mean. When you look at my blog post on fasting, many of my patients, they might skip the morning. Then for lunch, they have a very empty sort of a carb-based meal. And then all of a sudden they're starving. And if you look at their continuous glucose monitor data, their glucose has plummeted by 3, 4 p.m. So they're hypoglycemic. And when your blood sugar is low, you have a primal urge to eat everything in front of you. Even though I've done all this work, when hunger hits me like that, I will eat everything put in front of me. I have terrible willpower. So you have to be very preventive with this. If you want to avoid that 3, 4 p.m. surge of hunger, you have to start earlier in the day, which means when you have that first meal, that breakfast, hopefully a little bit later, 9 or 10 a.m. So remember, I talked about the eating windows. I like to push people towards, let's say, at 10 a.m. to 6 or 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. So what works well for me is the morning, first of all, because I'm fasted. If I exercise in a fasted state, I will burn a lot of fat. It's a very effective way. Even if you go for a 20, 30-minute vigorous walk with no food in your stomach, you can have your chai or coffee and then do that. You're going to burn fat and triglycerides and cleanse your liver. Then let's say that first meal is at 10 or 11. That could be your breakfast or brunch. My secret then after that is I typically eat my lunch around 3 p.m. And that prevents me from eating all the pantry snacks. Okay. I try to limit those, but sometimes just having kids, you have some of those. But if you have your meal at that time, great. And then I will finish off with my dinner by 6:30 or 7 p.m. So all the meals, we call this a compressed eating window. You've compressed them literally into the second half of the day, and then you're done for the night. And that tends to solve that problem because most of us aren't hungering for food in the first half, or we're going to the pantry trying to eat stuff at 9 or 10 in the morning, right? It's the second half of the day. So use that preventive strategy. And then when you are craving things like the carbs and the sweets, can it be fruit? Can it be other sources? So my other trick is if I've had a stressful day, I can tell if I didn't sleep well at night, I could already wake up telling this is going to be a tough day for me. I tend to eat fruits, a little bit more fruits than usual. So with my first meal, with my lunch, I'll have more berries. I might have an apple. I might have a little bit of a banana. I don't tend to eat a lot of fruits, but I'll actually do that as a mitigation strategy because the fruits have good nutrients in it. It keeps my glucose a little bit higher. So I'm not going to slump at 4 or 5 p.m. and eat everything in front of me. So those are some hacks that you can use to hopefully curb that ravenous hunger. But really, if you're having ravenous hunger, I guarantee your glucose has dropped too much. You're under eating, or you're just eating carbs and no protein and fat earlier. So you've got to change the composition of those meals.
Perfect. We are all familiar with the 3 o'clock low. So
right. Yeah.
a lot of solutions to that. I want to come back to a couple of diet questions, but move forward to more like lab testing and general lifestyle kind of preventive questions.
Sure.
You did mention LDLB as well as high sensitive CRP.
Yeah.
And the visceral fat versus the two scientists that you showed.
Yeah.
Any test to measure LDLB in the offing, and two, any test to measure body fat, especially fat?
Sure. Yeah. So listen, I work for a large healthcare system, and I'm all about ordering the right tests and not going crazy. But again, this is your body, so it just depends on how much you want to do. I think number one, let me tell you the baseline first. So from a standard cholesterol panel, so let me give you the cheap version. Okay. So here's the version that insurance will cover. You don't have to worry about paying extra for tests, nothing. I mean, for most of my patients, if I look at their standard cholesterol profile and their triglycerides are above 150, like I said, you've got type B LDL. It's a no-brainer for me. If you want to confirm it with the test, we can do it. If it's above 200, it's 99% mostly type B. Okay, so that's a simple thing. Now for body fat and visceral fat, but again, if you wanted to get additional testing, nowadays most insurances are mostly covering these advanced lipid profiles. So you're more than welcome to get that done to confirm that type B. It'll also tell you how many LDL particles you have. A lot of doctors don't know how to interpret the numbers. My book, actually, the cholesterol chapter, teaches you how, but I'm telling you it's not a necessity. It's just more confirmatory evidence that you've got a high-risk cholesterol profile. Like I said, those ratios are really the money. Now, for body fat, like I said, the waist to hip ratio is key, but some of my patients do get very motivated by knowing how much visceral fat do they have, how much subcutaneous fat, what's my total body fat percentage. So yeah, you can go out and get that tested. It's become much more affordable. People ask me about the body fat scales that you can get off Amazon. Those tend to be not very accurate. I haven't found a good, easy, affordable body fat tool that you can use at home. That's about to change. There's newer technologies coming out. But I do tell people that the delta tends to be fairly accurate. So even though the absolute number is not that great, if you make the right changes and you're weighing yourself naked in the morning at the same time, same hydration status, and you start seeing numbers go down, that's probably a pretty good signal that you're losing body fat. So those are the sort of ways I'd approach that. One other thing I didn't mention in this talk is if you've got a significant family history of early heart disease. And when I say family, I mean a first-degree family member, so a sibling or a parent. If they had early heart disease, which is very common in South Asians, you do want to make sure you're getting a test called the LP(a) or lipoprotein(a). That's a genetically inherited type of cholesterol particle, which can cause a lot more risk. And so when that is high, we'll be more aggressive, not just with lifestyle, but with medication strategies also. The other thing too, I don't want to complicate things, but one other thing to think about too, is if you do have a lot of these risks and you've got a family history, you can talk to your doctor about whether you need a heart scan or a coronary calcium scan, which is a CAT scan of the heart, which can already detect if you have early signs of plaque. So this is a test that has been a game changer for a lot of my patients, because everything else we're doing sort of data analysis, looking at multiple inputs, but I don't have X-ray vision. I'm trying to make an estimate based on my experience, but I can't see what's going on in the arteries of your heart. That calcium scan can be powerful. And nowadays there's a lot of centers that do it for $100 or $120. I'm starting to see insurance companies cover it. But if you want to learn more about this test, and if you might be a candidate for it, when you go to my blog, just put in heart scan into the search. And I did a very detailed post on different types of heart testing, including a heart scan. That will give you a lot of information. And then you can have an informed discussion with your doctor. But I think that's been a really great cutting edge test to use in practice.
Thank you. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that you're very passionate about this topic. And
thank you so much.
Quickly going through the diet, certain supplements, they've been asked, MCT oil, dates as source of sugar, and I'm not familiar with this one, monk fruit sweetener.
Yeah, sure.
All of these. So any comments?
Okay, so MCT oil is just a purified extract. It's the type of oil you basically get in coconut oil. So a certain percent of the coconut oil is MCT, which is a medium chain triglyceride. And the beauty of that MCT oil is that type of fat, it doesn't really get metabolized by the liver. It goes straight to the muscles and the brain for fuel. I have nothing against it. I have MCT oil that I sometimes will use. I might put it in my coffee or something. So there's not much downside to it. Unless you're somebody that is very cholesterol sensitive, then you have to be aware of different types of fat sources. So that's the MCT oil. The monk fruit, on the dates, let me get the dates. So dates, yes. One thing about my Indian patients is they love their dried fruits. And many of them tell me I'm eating lots of fruits and they're using the dried fruits. And dates do have good properties. It's a great source of fiber. It can keep our bowels regular, but they're pretty darn sweet, right? So if you have the discipline, with dates, small amounts are probably fine in the context of just a holistic, well-designed diet. I'm not going to ban them, but some of my patients, I have a hard time regulating my date intake. So that's why I tend to stay away from it, because even though it's got the fiber, it's very sweet tasting, which is why I don't even like a lot of, fake health foods out there that are low carb that taste very sweet. It just makes me too hungry. So I don't like that. Now, monk fruit. So when we talk about sweeteners, monk fruit is something that is a fairly neutral sweetener that does not tend to raise blood sugar. So I think monk fruit is reasonable, but do be aware that when you buy monk fruit from Amazon or something, a lot of times it's not 100% monk fruit. Sometimes they'll mix in other sweeteners with that. So you do pay extra for the pure monk fruit, but that's fine. So if you want to sweeten your coffee or your desserts with a type of sweetener that's safe and doesn't raise sugar, monk fruit's one of them, the good source. Erythritol is another one too. Coconut sugar does raise it a little bit, but it's got a pretty wholesome taste. It's not too bad. And then stevia. Most people don't like stevia because it has a bitter taste, but it's very sugar neutral. Like you could put that in your coffee or tea. You'll get no glucose spikes at all.
Okay,
great.
So just two very general questions. One, I'm looking at this whole thing, diet and lifestyle, exercise. I have a highly predisposed genetics and family history. Where do I start? What's my first step? Where should I focus on exercise, on diet, or checking your blog, or talking to you on the phone, have a personal consult?
I'll give you a couple places. So number one, this is a great question. So I would say, first of all, if we're doing neither, like some of my patients have been exercising a lot, right? They're seeing no results, so we have to fix the diet. Others have been on a low carb diet, but they're not doing the exercise. So if there's a gap between those two, you want to emphasize one over the other. Now, it's very common for my Indians that they're doing neither. They're overeating, plus, they're not exercising. And I would say if you want to start up in one area, I would start with the diet. Because quite frankly, when you're eating the wrong types of foods, when you remember my insulin resistant diagram, if most of the energy is going to your fat and it's going to your liver, your muscle fuel tank is empty. A lot of that fuel is not even going to your brain. So that means you don't have the motivation to exercise and your muscles don't have the energy to exercise. So when I realized, people that have insulin resistance, you can, this is very sad because sometimes spouses are going to call them lazy. What are you doing on the couch all the time? Go exercise. But it is a struggle to get yourself out of the chair and get outside and do anything. So I tell people first, you've got to put the right gasoline in the tank. So that means you've got to fix the diet, fix the insulin resistance. So be quantitative. Most of us are very metrically driven. So use a free app, use an app like There's Low Carb Manager, MyFitnessPal, whatever, and start putting in your dosas, chapatis, the foods, your honey bunches of oats. It's so easy to do that. And just like balancing your money, figure out how many grams of carb you're eating each day and start to make the changes that we talked about. So yeah, I would say probably the simplest place to start. You can go through my blog. It's got tons of information, but not to self-promote, but I think my book would be a good foundation point for you because you can understand a lot of these principles as well. And the same talk I've done for Google, if you look at my media section, I have tons of talks. So if you stitch all that together, you will start to see really good results and get your labs checked before and after to get issues. And I do have patients from all over the world that do consult with me. I've got a long waiting list, but if you did want to actually connect with me individual, that's an option as well. But I think there's tons of resources I've put out there already that can hopefully help you through this.
Great. So just to mention, your book is titled The South Asian Health Solution.
You got it, exactly.
I have a great question here on the Zoom. What questions or numbers should we look into? I think you answered that partly when we go to our annual physical. I mean, this is really because the providers are getting busy.
Yeah.
The annual physicals are getting compressed into smaller and smaller windows.
So true.
And
Yep.
we all have a lot of questions. So what is the most bang for the buck?
Yeah, so that's a great point. The good news is most providers, based on standard guidelines, should be doing a baseline cholesterol check. They should be checking a fasting blood sugar. I will often tack on the glucose A1C, especially if you have had a history of diabetes or your fasting blood sugars have been high. Getting that hemoglobin A1C, those are good starting points to start with. You should get most of the data. So use those numbers and then use my table, the reference ranges and start to look at that. And if any of those seem out of whack, then you can talk to your doctor about whether doing advanced lipid testing and those things make sense. But I think getting those is important. Now, the reason sometimes you have to be a little bit more persuasive with doctors is if you look at standard guidelines, the screening intervals and ages can often be a little bit further down the road. But Indians, we tend to develop heart disease and diabetes a decade or more earlier. So I think you're never too young to get those tests done. Even in kids, actually, my wife being a pediatrician, if one parent has high cholesterol, now the screening guidelines say that a child should probably have a baseline cholesterol done. Still a bit controversial, but most guidelines have said that. And I'm seeing so much of that talking to my pediatric colleagues that it's a good idea for kids to get that done too. But definitely getting those standard tests are a great starting point. And then I think the key thing where you might have to push your doctor a little bit is if those numbers are abnormal, you may want to check those numbers more frequently. So for example, if the triglycerides are high, have them rechecked after you made some changes in 3 or 4 months. Don't wait for your next yearly physical to get those done. And most docs are fine. Those are standard cheap tests you can get done.
Thank you. I promise I don't just have a few more questions.
No problem. Yeah.
Some people find it harder to lose weight than others. Is this true, or is it just somewhere we are missing something?
No, there can be a genetic tendency for some to have more of that stubborn fat that's much more difficult to lose. Some of that is genetics, and again, we don't want to blame our moms or grandmothers for this, but, if this is a case of, during pregnancy, if mom was insulin resistant, wasn't as active, it already sets up the baby, the child, the future baby to store more fat in certain areas that can be more difficult to lose. So I think we have to accept that and be gentle to ourselves because a lot of my women have a lot of self-hate. Why am I not losing weight? Why is this other person so skinny? I tried to explain to you the mechanism, and some of this is genetically predetermined. But the good news is when it comes to sort of the glucose, the lipid, the cholesterol issues, the things that are more going on inside, most of us can make significant changes in those areas. So definitely there are some genetic tendencies, but you've got to try everything possible. And again, to emphasize, especially because women are the ones that get stuck the most with weight loss, a lot of it does come down to stress and sleep. Those are very fat storing in women compared to men. And it's hard for women to accept that. They just can't believe it. They just want to diet harder and exercise more. But until they regulate the stress and sleep part, often I will not see them lose a single pound despite all the exercise and dietary efforts they're making. And often I'm taking my women and I'm actually lowering the intensity of exercise they're doing. And I'm trying to add more rest, more breathing, more yoga, more pranayama, whatever we can. And magically they do better because the stress situation causes the fat. Because just to give you an evolutionary point, when women are in times of famine, okay, when they're, in those environments of intense environmental stress, the protective response is to store more fat, to allow fertility, basically, and lactation. And even after pregnancy is done, the woman's body still has a tendency. So really releasing that emotional stress becomes a primary strategy. And then when you layer on the other sorts of exercises and things, then things can get much better through that.
Great. That's a great point. It's a precision medicine. It's not just like a supercomputer and you log
Right. Yeah,
put like the diet and the exercise and everything.
exactly. Yes.
South Asians, what age do you recommend starting all of these tests and preventive measures, or is there any such thing at all, or start as early as you can?
I say again, if you have like my kids had their first cholesterol test because I had high triglycerides, as you saw. So I had them get it at age 10, like 10 or 11, we had a baseline check then. For adults, I think age 18, they should definitely start at that point. But if you're already seeing, especially unfortunately with this pandemic, we're seeing obesity has gotten much worse for our kids and teens. The poor kids have not been able to go to school and play sports. So for many of them, it's not a bad idea for them to get a check. Again, if one of you has cholesterol, or if you've seen that they're overweight on their body mass index chart, there's no harm really to get it checked earlier. I would err on the side of earlier. At the very least, you have a baseline to follow over time. So I'm pretty bullish about that. Some docs might raise their eyebrows and say, oh, why would you check it that early? But this data, it's motivating. Just knowing your baseline and how it evolves over time is really important. And I see in college age kids, especially when they go off to the dorms and things, we have a baseline test from when they were in middle school or high school, and we see dramatic elevations in their triglycerides. And now we know that over that 3, 4, 5+ year period, they've already become significantly more insulin resistant. So we want to make sure we can implement preventive changes as early as possible.
Thank you again. So
yeah.
You showed us your numbers 2009 to 2013.
Yeah.
So I think I'm pretty sure you're maintaining the triglycerides to HDL cholesterol even in 2020 and 21.
Thank God. Okay, so one, in reference to that, so here's a situation. This is to give you guys a little bit more hope, okay? Because I know sometimes I've taken a little bit of hope away.
That's exactly why I'm asking. That's
right? Okay. Yes. Here's the whole. Okay, so I will tell you. So when I was insulin resistant, okay, because my muscles were not clearing glucose adequately. When you are insulin resistant, you are carb sensitive, right? You smell carbs and you gain weight. You go beyond your threshold. You're living a life that is within a very tight window. That's no way to live. So if you can give yourself at least 2-3 months to clear out the garbage, clear out the closet, okay, get the muscles stronger and ready, guess what? You got much more metabolic flexibility. That means that now the same cup of rice that used to send your sugar and triglycerides screaming through the roof is not going to be a problem. Rice used to drive my sugar crazy. Now I don't even really watch it because my muscles are so active now and they're so strong. I can go out and I can eat like I used to when I was a teenager, but I don't have to be as careful as I was before. So that's the hope. Like, get your body fixed, and then you'll see that, glucose levels don't go up as much. You're going to recheck your triglycerides in 3 months. And even though Diwali came around, yeah, your numbers are a little bit higher. They're not too bad. The pandemic is a perfect example. My patients that were doing really well in the pandemic, despite them being at home and baking and eating garbage, yes, some of them did get a lot worse, but many of them, they were resilient. I call it metabolic resiliency. Their numbers stayed pretty good throughout that. But the ones that started off and they didn't make the changes, they got much worse during the pandemic. And we checked their numbers after they reconnected, things got a lot worse. But you do want to develop that resiliency because that'll allow you to deviate during holidays, festivities, and vacations and not get into trouble. That's really a key point about this.
Actually, it answers the question of carb craving will also go down to some extent with insulin resistance.
Absolutely. Yeah. For everyone. Yes. Everyone gets a reduction in carb cravings when they can get insulin resistance under control.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think you've been so gracious to stay a little extra and answer all the questions. And I can't ask for any better in terms of patience and passion, and as well as giving us all the resources that you have at your in your blog and you've developed over the years and personal experience. I just want to check with the organizers, Murali, Dwarki, and Madhu, to see if anything more, or are we?
Yeah, I think this is a good time to say thank you to our guest. I think we had a wonderful experience. I'll let Nikhila take over and say a few words, unless Dr. Shashidhar, you have something to add.
I just
No,
want to wish him the best, Dr. Sinha, and we
you.
hope to see you again, and maybe in person at some point. And this was a great session, and I hope I'm pretty sure the audience felt the same way, but I also hope this would be a good big step forward for them in terms of lifestyle and what they can adapt and how they can be better informed and moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a goal of my job. So thank you for the platform. And as I looked in your organization, it's very impressive. You guys are so service oriented. So thanks for everything you do for the community. It's been an honor.
Thank you. I think we should get off to Nikhila.
Yeah, let me take the opportunity. Well, it was a very, very, very information loaded session and eye opener for everyone, whether they're battling with insulin or not. I think the lesson is not to let your guard down at any point, right? Just even if you're doing great with your food and exercise and everything, stress and sleep, you just have to keep at it. And that was very, very well said, and really appreciate all the information and guidance received. Dr. Sinha, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart on behalf of Seva Mandaara and New England Kannada Koota for spending your valuable Saturday afternoon, I guess, for you, evening for us. Thanks so much again. It was so wonderful.
Thank you.
And the recording is there for people who have missed it. I hope they all watch it. It's definitely a very informative session. Yeah, so I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Shashidhar, who was the force behind today's session, and also so wonderfully moderating the Q&A session. He, being a doctor, I think had all the questions, bunched or bundled and channeled it so well.
Actually, I didn't get a chance to thank you. You did do a wonderful job at that. I give talks for a lot of companies, and sometimes it's a headache because they want me to field the questions, but you made my life a lot easier so I could focus on the response rather than my head spinning from all these chat boxes. So thank you for doing that for me.
Absolutely. Again, Dwarki was responsible for grouping and channeling the questions from different places. So if any of your questions didn't get answered, you know whom to blame. But thanks so much, Dwarki. But again, this event was seamlessly brought to you, even though we had a little bit of a technical glitch in the beginning, but our technical expert, Madhu Akibbar, has been a wonderful resource to bring all these events. So thank you, Madhu. And lastly, but most importantly, I would like to thank Murli Kudlagi, who has been the champion of Seva Mandaara for the past 2 years and has worked tirelessly and enthusiastically, paying equal and utmost attention to every project of Seva Mandaara. And he and his team have raised and donated thousands of dollars. I think, to be precise, the number is $50,000. A little bit here and there, but to the neediest and most deserving. So they had a lot of projects going on. Thanks again from the bottom of all our hearts, Murli. That I think concludes the session. So good night, everyone. Enjoy the spring. Be safe and healthy.
Have a good evening. Take care, everyone. Wish you all good health. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.